Dr. Wilf, we know that the year of 2020 that shook the entire world, given the fact that not only that the pandemic took place, but also we are looking at how this entire world lived under the word globalization. And of course, today, when we talk about globalization, you are the expert on economic study. Now, from your perspective, how would you describe this current economic impact or this economic situation in Israel, especially when it's building this ties or trying to maintain this close ties with the Western Hemisphere?
Well, one of the things that, Israel, like everyone else, has noticed that not only is our world getting smaller and closer and tighter knit together, it has more and more diverse players. It's not the 90s now where after the fall of the Soviet Union, America was basically global cop and hyperpower. We're looking at other major countries. And one of the things that Israel did well in the last, I think, decade, even two, is to begin to diversify its foreign policy. America remains the most important ally, of course, but you've seen Israel in recent years reach out to India, to China, to Africa, to Latin America. So you're beginning to, we're a small country at the end of the day, but we're reaching out, we are to a wide range of countries and really to our region. For many years, for many decades really, Israel was basically an island. It's why we love our airport so much, because we can't pick up the car and go anywhere. All the countries around us basically kind of shunned us for many decades. So Israel behaved like an island, and much of its economic policy, the free trade area with Europe, the close ties with the US, were that of an island. Most countries, if you look at their economic trade, they trade with their neighbors.
Right.
Their neighbors are first their major trading partners and then everybody else.
Right.
Israel did not trade with its neighbors because its neighbors would not trade with it.
Right.
So our trading kind of patterns were as if we were in an island between Europe and the US. Now we're like an island between Europe, the US, and China. So we're kind of back physically where we belong. But for the first time, you're seeing rising trade with Gulf countries, with Arab countries. The more of that's going to happen, there's only good in it.
It's so interesting that, Dr. Wilf, you mentioned about the country of China. And we know that this week or this month, it seems so busy for the country of China. Not only this ongoing Winter Olympics, but also under this big or a grand project. It's called a One Belt, One Road initiative. And again, based on our latest report, and the country of Argentina just joined this project. So which, meant a great deal, not only to China, but also to internationally. Dr. Wilf, I want you to help us to understand the business, or from this economic perspective, how significant for Israel to reach out to China, or how significant to see that China, which crossed the continent to build this economic partners with Israel, because given this condition for Chinese people, we've heard this country, we probably would travel to this region, as a tourist, but right now looking at the moment, or even looking ahead, it's almost impossible to think about this business opportunities or this economic reciprocal relationship between Israel and China. Can you help us to understand a little bit?
Yes, certainly. Like in many other places in the last decade especially, China has become more and more involved economically in Israel, and ports and infrastructure and investments. And this has been something that Israel was very keen on. As I said, we've been pursuing for over a decade a policy of expanding economic and diplomatic ties with more and more countries, closer ties with more countries. And China is very important to Israel. I think the only thing that's becoming a problem, and I would say it's unfortunate, is you're beginning to see Americans telling Israel that it should limit its relationship with China, which I think is unfortunate and unnecessary. And I hope that Israel will find a way to balance all its relations for its benefits. So that's the one thing I've seen recently, and I'm not too happy about that part.
Dr. Wilf, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about the younger generations. And we know that, again, across the continent, younger generations today, not only they're changing political, but also social and cultural agendas. From protesting towards the government and also voice the opposition towards foreign policy, etc. Now, from your years of experience in foreign policy, in education, etc., how active are the younger generations today in Israel in terms of participating political and social movements? And by the results, how effective is it?
So in Israel, the young generation actually has quite a few successes to its name in the last more than a decade, which is not what you typically think about. When you talk to pollsters in America, they will all tell you that the young generation might protest, but the older generation votes. But in Israel, for example, you had about a decade ago a very big economic protest movement together, interestingly, with the protest movements of the Arab Spring. It happened about the same time, and it was quite effective in promoting certain reforms in Israel, in our economic structure, opening up certain sectors. We had the younger generation very involved in the last political rounds, mostly to try to replace the government, and ultimately they succeeded. So by and large, the young generation in Israel they've been going out to the streets. It's also easier here, the weather's nice, the country is small, so protesting is always somewhat easier. But they've been protesting and for a long time and have been quite effective in achieving some of their goals. And Israel in general, I'm sure people know that, is a very political, involved society.
Well, now, just along with that said, do you think today the younger generations in Israel, and of course I don't mean just ask you that question, and I ask that question to all the guests on the show, is we tend to see the word democracy, where we tend to retranslate or re-understand the word of democracy in the year 2022. Now, for the younger generations or for the people in Israel, do you think that the word democracy or the translation, the meaning of democracy, has always been the same as what we think from this Western culture? Or today, for the people in Israel, maybe the word democracy or the word freedom can be interpreted in a new way?
So democracy is always hotly debated, but that's in the nature of Israel. Israel is amazingly, very few people are aware of it, but Israel is one of the world's oldest continuous democracies, which seems weird. We think of Israel as a young country, but when you understand that most countries were established after Israel, about 2/3 of the world countries were established after Israel. The entire Eastern Soviet Union, Eastern Europe were not democratic nations, Africa, Latin America. So Israel is actually one of the world's oldest continuous democracy, and a very boisterous one. And in many ways, you could argue that the culture of argumentation even precedes Israeli democracy into our pre-state Congress and to the Jewish culture in general, which is a built-in culture of argumentation. So there's a lot of arguments about what democracy is and what it constitutes. And in Israel, everyone likes to proclaim literally every single day that this is the end of democracy. No matter what anyone says or does, this is the end of democracy. But in practice, we're actually one of the oldest democracies, and I think more than anything, it's because of this inherent culture of argumentation.
Dr. Wilf, I want to end our conversation with the last question going back to your book. Again, I know your book is targeted not only for the people, say in America, but also internationally. So let's just say after a reader or after anyone finish reading your book, how Western indulgence of the Palestinian dream has obstructed the path to peace, what would you like, or what are you hoping that the reader should understand one significant matter from reading your book?
I would like the reader to understand what the conflict is about and has always been about the Arab and Palestinian rejection of the equal Jewish right to self-determination. And I would like them to understand how, especially Western indulgence, mostly through funding, but also diplomatically, how indulging Palestinian rejectionism has merely fueled the conflict. And I would like people to understand that they might feel good about giving money, but we here pay the price for it in blood, for their feeling good. So I would say, stop pouring fuel on the fire. This is what this indulgence of Palestinian rejectionism does. It fuels the conflict, and then there's another generation of people who pay the price here. So I would like them to tell their governments, stop pouring fuel on the fire.
Well, and I hope that more readers can understand the point and really appreciate the critical and important matters embedded in this book.